Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Women's Rights panel discussion. I'm Jasmine, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this evening for this important conversation. Today, we're here to explore various aspects of women's rights, address challenges, celebrate achievements, and discuss the way forward. Now, let's introduce our panelists who bring a wealth of knowledge, experience to this discussion. We'll start from my left to right and have you all introduce yourself and the organizations that you represent.
Well, hello, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Charlene Bell. I am a family nurse practitioner and a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, and I'm also the founder of Her Pad of Truth, a nonprofit organization that helps to provide menstrual hygiene products to women who are homeless, living in impoverished conditions, and are in transition.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Charlie Cole. I am the Black Organizing Program Leader and also the Raise Program Leader for Planned Parenthood, Virginia. I work in the communities to uplift the Black and Latina communities so that way they're able to have equal reproductive rights.
Thank you, Charlie.
Hi, my name is Kenya Haro Perez. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I serve as the Virginia State Manager for the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. And we basically just provide education, resources, and do advocacy work, for abortion rights, abortion work related to the Latina community.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Vanessa Goodar. I am a community psychologist from Chicago, Illinois, as well as an assistant professor of psychology here at Hampton University.
Thank you. Before we dive into our discussion, I'd like to establish some guidelines to ensure productive conversation. We encourage open dialogue, respect for differing perspectives, and active listening. Please be mindful of time to allow all panelists to contribute, and I'll also reserve time for questions from our audience towards the end. Each question posed will be given about 3 minutes to answer. To kick off our discussion, let's begin with the foundational question. What does women's rights mean to each of you personally, and why do you think it's essential for society? We'll start from my left.
Ooh, okay. I think that women's rights is important because we are the givers of life, right? I think that it's very important that we are respectful as it relates to women's health, but that we also educate women and men on the rights that they do have, because many women don't know what their rights are. I also think that it's important that not only do we take the knowledge that we gain in this room, but we also help to expand it out into different areas and territories. So not just your sisters and your brothers and things of that nature, but even if you go abroad. I think that it's really important when you do go to different countries, you see that women's rights looks totally different than when you're here in the United States. And I think sometimes if we were able to come outside of the United States and see those different areas, we'll have more of an appreciation for women's rights.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. Ms. Charlie.
Yes, women's rights to me is the ability to live within autonomy in your own body. It's incredibly important that we're able to have a voice in our own country, and especially making sure that, you know, not only are we being advocated for properly, but as well that we're being listened to. For me, protecting women's rights is an opportunity to represent the rights of others as well.
Yes, +1 to everything that they just mentioned. I think I would only say, to take it a step further, is that I think women's rights can also be encompassed to be rights for anyone, really. I think it could also really cover a lot of trans rights too. I think that when we have these conversations, it is essential to put the whole gender spectrum when we talk about reproductive rights, just because I think that no matter how someone identifies, I think that people that have uteruses have just a wealth of knowledge to bring to conversations. I think that their experiences and perspectives are important when we have these conversations, and I think that for us to truly be equitable in the education that we give, in the resources that we give, and the advocacy that we do, I think it's important for us to know everyone that's along for this journey. And so I think that women's rights for me, especially to what Charlie said, I think it really encompasses autonomy, and the autonomy to make choices over your own body. And it also just means to be able to live, work, play, etc. freely in the skin that you're in, and to be able to do whatever you want within those circumstances. But to first and foremost, to be able to have that access to do it anyway, I think is supremely important.
All of that. There's not much left to say that hasn't been said, but to me, women's rights is freedom. And I think about, I'm an 80s baby, and I just think about, like, my mom used to talk about the burning, my grandma too, would talk about the burning of the bras and the things like from the 70s and, those different women's movements. I think about Sojourner Truth, I think about some of the, like, Angela Davis and different folks throughout the decades that have really moved women's rights forward. And I honestly think about how, as an 80s baby, I took a lot of that for granted, thinking that it never would change, and look at where we are in 2024, where those rights don't even exist anymore federally. So I think that when I think about women's rights, it represents freedom.
Thank you so much, ladies, for sharing your insight. Now we're going to delve a little bit deeper into specific topics. Please note that the following questions are grouped by segments, but we'll examine them in various orders. Please look at the projector screens on both sides of the stage. Each segment's questions will be displayed there. The first segment is going to be education and menstruational health. For this segment, we'll have Dr. Goodar and Dr. Bell take the lead. Dr. Bell, we'll be starting with you. Dr. Bell, what are the common cultural taboos and stigmas associated with menstruation in different societies, and how do they affect women's rights and mental well-being?
Oh, hold on, she's gonna have to go back to that question.
that's
I told you I had a
my
progressive
question.
hand. Can you find that question, huh? Oh, you have a different question up there. It's okay. I think you have to go back a little bit. Can you repeat?
I can. What are the common cultural taboos and stigmas associated with menstruation in different societies, and how do they affect women's rights and mental well-being?
All right, so we were talking about some of the cultural taboos. I'm also an 80s baby, right? And also of West Indian descent. So one of the biggest taboos that I remember growing up is don't go in the ocean when you have your period, because if you do, you're gonna get attacked and killed by a shark. So because I couldn't swim anyway, in the cities of New York, like the most pool that I ever had was like the fire hydrant with like a can and stuff like that. So I always believed that, all right, don't go in the pool, don't go in the ocean because you're gonna get eaten by a shark, right? Some of the other stigmas that surround menstruation, oh, you're dirty, you're nasty, or you're evil. Every month you are evil, you're snappy, you're agitated and things of that nature. And I noticed that especially here within just the United States, not realizing until I went abroad, like last year I went to Ghana, and I had the privilege of staying in a beautiful village called the Akusa village in Winneba, Ghana. And in Winneba, when young girls have their period, when they have their period, they have to stay home. They're ostracized, right? They're not, certain places within Akusa village, they're not able to cook. They're not able to wash the clothes. They're not able to do any of that. The reason why is because it's the mindset that if you touch something, you're gonna make it unclean. Ain't that something? Where life comes from? So some of these taboos and societal myths that we have seen has caused a lot of mental anguish on women. And it caused mental anguish to the point where many women, they despise their period every single month, not realizing that every time you bleed, it should be a reminder that you could bring life into the world. Every time you bleed, it is a reminder that that you are still living. But a lot of times, because we have looked at our menstrual cycle as something nasty, that's something that every month is a downer or things of that nature, we don't look at it from a positive perspective. So for me, as a vaginal enthusiast, period advocate, I think that it's really important for us to change the dynamic and also change the language surrounding menstruation and just realize it's a party in your pants every single month.
Love that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Gooder, how does the lack of access to comprehensive sexual education impact young women's understanding of their reproductive rights and health?
I love this question because, so as a community psychologist, we tend to look at problems from a societal perspective and not an individual perspective. I also am born and raised in Chicago. And back home, I have the privilege of having a soror who started an organization called Pretty. And Pretty is the only sexual education curriculum available for Chicago public school students. And I get to see what girls benefit, what the benefit of girls being exposed to communication and empowerment as it relates to their bodies at the age of 10. I can think back to when I was 10, and even though I didn't want to talk about it with my parents and my grandparents, I definitely was exposed to sexual situations through Degrassi and different things that, you know, we watch in pop culture, you know, for shout out to the 80s babies watching Degrassi. Not the Drake one. Not the Drake one. Yeah, it was on Channel 11. It was like Channel 11. But I remember learning about sex from my peers. And I think organizations like Pretty, where you go into classrooms, you talk with girls about the different scenarios that you can end up in, and also focusing on young women, because so much of that burden is put on us. It's like when it comes to sexual violence and things like that, we have to make sure that girls really understand what tools we can put in our own hands to make sure that we're safe and we're making decisions, not necessarily based in religion or based in any particular value set, but just based in what do I want? What do I need? And what ways can I get what I want without compromising my safety, you know, while getting those things. So I think that, you know, sexual education is hugely impactful. I think it should start earlier, and I think that schools should do a better job of making sure that little girls have access to women who can talk to them and mentor them as it relates to sexual education.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woodard. Dr. Bell, what are the educational gaps regarding menstruation, and how does inadequate knowledge contribute to shame, embarrassment, and negative perceptions of menstruation among women and girls?
So the reason why I like this question is because a lot of times we focus on educating young women when there are young men that also need to be educated and being brought up into the conversation. And the reason why I say that is because there was an incident, a story of a husband whose wife needed some pads. He didn't know what kind of pads she needed. So he got these like huge bricks, super thin, you know, absorbent pads that look like bricks and stuff like that, and then brought it home. And he was like, he had thins, he had panty liners and all kinds of stuff, but he felt very uncomfortable. And it was the cashier that was like, well, does your wife have a heavy flow? Does she have a light flow? How many days? He was like, I don't know, she's flowing, so she needs something. But I think that is very important to talk about menstruation, especially in school. So we really don't do, especially here in Virginia, they don't really do a good job in their sex ed class. You know, it's like a picture of a phallus, and you know, it's a picture of a vagina, and like, oh, this is the labia. But then really not talking about what encompasses menstruation, especially for young girls. Another thing in regards to the shame and embarrassment, imagine being a fifth grader, because these kids are getting their period as early, some in the third grade, okay? That's what, 9-ish. Imagine being a third grader and you sitting up there, you're in school, and then all of a sudden, boys like, ooh, Shaquana got something on the back of her pants. So now, because we have not taught kids about menstruation and to not look at it as if it's nasty and that it's a joke, now they're making fun of the young girl. So now she feels a certain way because it's something that her body is doing naturally. You fail to realize what seed that plants in a young girl as she gets older. Now all she remembers is, I have the embarrassment of something that naturally happens to me. So I think by educating not only our males but also our females on what menstruation is, that is nothing to look bad about. It's a natural way of life. Because there's kids in the audience, but no one's saying, oh, look, you know, you have a wet dream. Like, you know, no one's doing that to young boys. But I think it's very important that we teach our young males sensitivity as it relates to menstruation, and so that they can be knowledgeable as well.
Thank you. Dr. Goodar, what are the implications of limited access to menstrual hygiene products for girls in low-income communities, and how does this impact their ability to attend school regularly?
Ooh, that one is loaded. So I think about this question. I have the blessing of that background in K-12 education. So I just think about all of the girls that I don't even have a period anymore. I got a hysterectomy a long time ago. But for me, you know, it's important to make sure I have those supplies in my classroom. And I could just think back to so many girls who would come like, can you slide me a little something? Because we didn't have free tampons and pads in our schools. Then I think about here, it's not necessarily the low income, but I think about girls and the access to products. And I also think about the mental capacity, like your physical being when you are menstruating. Sometimes it just, for me personally, I used to have endometriosis, PCOS, just a multitude of different issues going on, which led to infertility for me. And I just think about just knowing what was going on with my body was just really powerful. But my students, like, I have students who get completely incapacitated when they are menstruating, and they email me and say, look, doc, I ain't coming today. I can't stand. My vision is blurry. So I think just the education of just knowing what is happening to your body, because when I was in 3rd grade having my period for the first time, in 5th grade when my white dress at graduation got stained, I remember that shame and guilt and embarrassment, and it really brought me into myself and made me not want to get help. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think that open, honest conversations is definitely the place to start.
Thank you. Dr. Bell, how do socioeconomic factors such as poverty and lack of access to menstrual products and sanitation facilities exacerbate menstrual hygiene challenges and impact women's mental health?
So, I was just talking about this earlier today. So 1.8 million administrators in the state of Virginia do not have access to menstrual hygiene products. Over 230,000 menstruators here in Virginia are living below 100% below the poverty line, right? So there are women that are in the state of Virginia that are using makeshift products in order to catch their flow, right? A lot of times we look at women who are displaced or women who may be unhoused, and we're like, okay, yeah, you know, they need menstrual hygiene products. But believe it or not, it's that mother who got 3 daughters is considered middle class, and they all bleed, it seems like, all the time, okay? So they're constantly changing their menstrual hygiene products and or constantly changing their pads. For me, I noticed that here also in the state of Virginia, there's only 26 states in our country that have removed tampon tax. It wasn't until 2023 that every woman in here who has a vagina, you were getting taxed for your menstrual hygiene products. And you can't get it back, and you can't claim it on your taxes, all right? So every single month, you were taxed for something that happened to you naturally. But men who would use condoms, it wasn't taxed. And the reason why is because condoms were considered a medical necessity. So for many women, especially during that time, there was one point in time when menstrual hygiene products cost more than cigarettes. It was cheaper to smoke and just get lung cancer than to find a pad at that time. So you have so many women and young girls who don't have access to menstrual hygiene products just because they do not have the money for it. And here in the state of Virginia, it wasn't until 2020 that they passed the law which made the government tell schools that they had to provide menstrual hygiene products to their students. So you would have countless girls that would miss countless days of school because of their period pain, and they were not able to go to school. And if they did go to school, some of the schools were not mandated to provide menstrual hygiene products. So those nurses were taking money out their own pocket to buy pads to give to young girls. Now, if you're a young girl who just started your period and you have a very heavy flow, but the nurse only has a pack of 28, unfortunately, you can only get one. So it's things of that nature that we have to think about when we think about people who may be homeless, or even young girls that may be even in your churches, you know? Have a little basket and have some pads or things of that nature, because you never know who may need one.
Thank you. Dr. Gooder, how do discriminatory laws and policies regarding reproductive rights and access to contraception impact young women's autonomy over their bodies and futures?
I think it's really interesting coming from Chicago and coming from a state, thinking about taking things for granted, right? I talked earlier about, you know, thinking about some of those greats from the 70s and 80s and we just took those rights for granted that they fought really hard to get. And thinking about the state of, you know, where we are with Roe v. Wade, and just it opened up a can of worms. And I think that it's really unfortunate that now it's state to state whether we have these protections or not. And I don't think that it's enough fuss being made. It's not enough. It's enough awareness, I think, but not enough action that's happening to kind of move us back to whatever Roe v. Wade gave us. I don't know what our new normal is going to be. I'm really, really nervous for my 16-year-old daughter and what her rights will be, even in Chicago, where it's a state where you can get abortion if you need, if that's your choice. I just think that I don't know what we need to do to get back to the Roe v. Wade days, but it's concerning for me as a parent, and all I can do is come to places like this where we can have these open dialogues and conversations. But I'm really curious about what the policy is going to look like and kind of morph into now that we're in this post era of Roe v. Wade. Like, where do we go from here is really concerning. I need people to get out there and vote too, because that's really the main reason why we're in this predicament now. But it's only so much that you can do with talking. And I just wonder, what can we do as a community to come together to make sure that those protections kind of come back to a federal level and not just be sprinkled throughout our country.
Thank you. Dr. Bell, how do discriminatory policies and practices such as inadequate menstrual leave policies or the lack of affordable menstrual products in workplaces and schools impede women's rights and mental health?
Listen, if I had a quarter for every time I had to go ahead and put a little quarter in to go ahead and get a pad or something like that, for me, a lot of the laws are made by people don't even have a vagina but enjoy the vaginal experience, which bothers me. Come on now. Sorry, children. But I mean, really, it took Virginia years for them to just say, you know what? We believe that women who are in prison in the state of Virginia, prison and jail, should have access to free menstrual hygiene products. And they were told no for years. Male legislators said that young girls should learn responsibility and bring their own pads with them to school. These are from people who have no womb, no uterus, no cramp, no nothing, right? So for me, when it comes to some of these policies, I think because the people who are writing them do not look like me, and when I'm cute, don't have what I have, or are not housing the organs that I'm housing, it's hard for them to understand. So even with menstrual leave, now this is the thing. I've been trained that if my patient tells me that they're in pain, then they're in pain. And if they say that they're a 10 but they're smiling, then they're a 10 and they're smiling, right? So pain is subjective. So everyone carries it differently. I think sometimes the fear with menstrual leave is, if we can be honest, it can be abused, right? Like, oh, I got my period, and then you in Cancun, and we see it on your TikTok now.
Yeah.
And now you've messed it up for everybody else, I do think that it's important that we understand different types of menstrual disorders. That way, workers and not even employees and also even bosses can understand, okay, well, why do you need this leave? Now I understand what menstrual disorders are. Because the first thing a man will say, oh, you cramps? That's okay, I'm blind 7 days out the month, every single month, okay? I can't see, I can't think straight, I can't drive, I can't eat, I can't move, the lights hurt, I can't even function, I can't even think clearly. But that's hard for someone to understand when they've never been through it. And then lastly, when you talked about the lack of affordable menstrual hygiene products, like I said, just the thought, it's hard enough for many people to just live, right? You have to live, you gotta pay bills, you gotta feed your kids, you gotta bathe, multiple times throughout the day if you have to, it takes time. So just to know that my last $10 has to go to a pack of pads that's already gonna cost me $9.90 and it only has like 15 in it, that's a lot for someone to deal with. Let alone, I have to deal with the struggles of life, of being a woman, of being black, of being a mom, of being pulled in so many different directions, and being a professional, and then I have to bleed too. So I think people don't realize how that compounds on a person psychologically. And then when mommy spaz out, or wifey spaz out, then you're looking at like, what's wrong with you? It's that time of the month, ain't it? Like, yes, it's been there all month. So I think that it's very important that these conversations, that these spaces are held so that we can educate people.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Goodhart, how does the lack of diverse representation in media and popular culture influence the self-esteem and perceptions of beauty and worth among young girls?
Ooh, you got good ones.
That's a good one. You got good ones too,
I mean,
Shorty.
that's good.
So I think about, like, you know, one of the reasons that I came here to teach at Hampton University was a different world, right?
Yep.
Love a different world. They were in Virginia, and, you know, I think about the Whitleys of the world, you know, and just the aesthetic that a Whitley gives. And it wasn't until, I don't remember seeing women who I feel like really look like me until I was well into my 30s, like, as far as like visible in media. So I think that now that I have the opportunity to teach young women and young men here at Hampton and see like what they are seeing on TikTok, what they're seeing on their socials, it's really a distorted perception of what beauty is. And I think self-esteem is just like the baseline. We need to be looking at radical self-love and radical acceptance, because a lot of times we are measuring ourselves based on what we see on socials. And for a long time, I didn't see anything on socials that looked like me, that reflected beauty to me in my eyes, in my perspective. So I think that our socials, you know, is struggling. It's still creating a struggle for our young girls, but we're starting, I see that Generation Alpha, Generation Z, I'm seeing them starting to push back on that narrative of what Eurocentric beauty looks like and defining beauty for themselves, and really making sure that girls, we go on campus and we say, girl, I love them shoes, your hair is fire, the earrings, everything put together, okay? And just really encouraging one another so that we can create that standard for ourselves. You know, Hampton is the standard of excellence, you know, but I think that we need to understand what that standard means to us as individuals, and we can define that for the community based on what we think.
Thank you. Dr. Bell, what are the psychological effects of menstruation-related disorders such as premenstrual dysphoric disorder, known as PMDD, and dysmenorrhea on women's mental health, and how can access to proper healthcare and support services be improved?
Yay! So let me give you the easy definition of what PMDD is, right? So PMDD is not just PMS. So you may have heard PMS, like you're PMSing, but PMDD is more psychological, where during the specific almost 7 days prior to your cycle, you start to now exhibit symptoms of depression, anxiety, sometimes executive function issues. You start to, even at times, can have hallucinations, signs of delusions, and even have suicidal thoughts. With PMDD, your hormones are heightened to a point where it now is starting to cause you psychological distress, right? Dysmenorrhea is just really bad period pain. And sometimes it can make you feel as though that is death as well. A lot of times people have dismissed it because they'll just say, take a Motrin, take Midol, or something of that nature. With PMDD, a lot of times with a lot of my clients, sometimes it can be treated with birth control. A lot of times it is treated at times with antidepressants and antipsychotics. So sometimes we will use Prozac or we'll use Abilify, and we'll use it in short stints just during that time of the month to help to regulate those emotional thoughts, and also if there's any type of mental health disparate mental health issue that's going on. In regards to how can, it says, how can access to proper health care and supportive services be improved? I don't think that you have to be an that you have to be a mental health expert in order to know what PMDD is. If you are a primary care provider, if you are an OBGYN, if you are a neurologist, okay? I think that it's important that if you have a female patient, that a lot of times what I will see is primary care providers who will be like, you know what, let me go ahead and just refer you out. When you don't have to refer the patient out, you can handle it right then and there. But because they do not feel equipped to handle anything that has to deal with the mind, they'll be quick to refer. The issue with that is sometimes it takes anywhere to see me 8 to 12 weeks. It's just because I'm that good, right? Because I'm booked out. So now you have a woman who is in distress for 3 months until she can find the help that she needs. So I think that it's important. I also want to add this. A lot of times PMDD is familial, meaning there's a familial link in the family, right? So you may not even notice it, but if you think back to how mama used to spaz out every day, like certain times of the month, it could be that it's a familial link. Also, there has been links to PMDD and trauma. So certain traumatic experiences that you've had in childhood that you have not dealt with, I call it the pop goes the weasel, when, you know what I'm saying, you stuff it down. And then when it's 3 days before your period, it's like, period comes, woo, I can't stand everybody. Why you didn't close the door? Why are all the lights on? Why you breathing so hard? Why you smell like baby oil? And all this stuff. He's like, I always wear baby oil. Like, just like you said you like the baby oil. You know what I mean? So a lot of times, PMDD is also linked to trauma. And when you have unresolved trauma, you will always have issues. So sometimes getting to the root of your trauma can actually help resolve a lot of your PMDD symptoms. If y'all need to talk more about that, I'll be in a minute.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for highlighting some of the stigmas behind menstruation and the implications of and lack of education and resources. Next, we will move into our immigrations portion of our reproductive health segment. Charlie, we're going to start with you. Charlie, how do societal norms and cultural beliefs impact a woman's reproductive choices and autonomy?
So I'd start off by saying the external challenge is building trust between women in the community. The biggest part is the fact that they're not understood. A lot of it comes from, their demographic. There's a lot of stigma that exists within the Black and Latina community. And as well, it has a lot to do with their, not just cultural beliefs, but like their religion as well. A lot of the times, sorry y'all, a lot of the times, some of the biggest issues that they face is a source of patriarchy. It makes women feel like their life is limited and that they're not able to, sorry, I'm really sorry, y'all. I'm trying to get through it.
You sound good.
Okay. I'm sorry. I have anxiety. So. Okay, so yes, patriarchy limits a lot of the ways that women are able to speak up for themselves. We don't have a community that automatically thinks about the way that things impact women day to day on a day-to-day basis. It's not just the way that people see them. It's the way that they have to live life in society. Like you mentioned, poverty being an issue, not having the proper resources, and as well, they just want to be able to have the right to feel like a functional human being. And a big issue that we're facing now, especially at Planned Parenthood, is the fact that their rights are being revoked, their ability to feel like they can speak out and receive the services that they need.
Thank you, Ms. Charlie. Ms. Kenya, what are some of the specific challenges faced by Latin immigrant women regarding access to health care, education, and employment opportunities?
Yeah, this is a loaded question. However, there's a lot of challenges that face Latina women, predominantly immigrants. I will say that in Virginia alone, research that the Latina Institute had was that about like half of the population in Virginia that identifies as like being Latina is foreign born, which means that of all the Latina identifying people that live in Virginia, about half of them aren't from here. They don't identify as being born from here or Virginia being their home, right? Which says a lot, which means that this is a very large swath of people, right? And we may not see all of them in Hampton Roads because a lot of them live in other areas, mostly like Northern Virginia, or we're starting to see big demographics in like the Valley with agricultural labor. But this brings a unique set of issues and challenges for people that are not just have intersections with being Latina, but that are also immigrants and all the things that they then come with, right? So it's like what you mentioned, it's trauma that people already come with when they come to this country, right? And not just cultural trauma, because it's a huge cultural shift when they come to this country, in just like services that they can and can't have, racism that they experience, systems that they can't get into, right? So that's just baseline, things that affect them, things that they come in with from their own countries. And then when they get here, they realize that they have issues in accessing healthcare, education, and employment, first and foremost because perhaps they're monolingual Spanish speakers, they don't have, there's no language justice, even though there's no official language in the United States, it's very predominantly English. And there's a stigma to not speaking English, even though there is no national language, even though there is no official language. The United States is very nationalistic in that way, right? And so that's one of the biggest barriers, is this: there's no language justice. You know, at the Latina Institute, we disseminate resources and do education in monolingual Spanish, but we're the only org in Virginia that does that for Latinas. And so, like, think about that. Put it into perspective, just like the amount of things that Latinos don't have access to, that no one that looks like them, except for me and Latina Institute or other Latinos in Latina Institute, can advocate for them on their behalf, can advocate on policy on their behalf. It wasn't up until a few sessions ago in the General Assembly that driver's licenses for all were passed. So think about it. I mean, you think about immigrants that are in this country, they could be undocumented, but I mean, they're not gonna go anywhere. So it's like, either they stay here and we just let them rock without a license, or we say, okay, you can have a license because you're not gonna go anywhere anyway, right? And so how does that doesn't just preclude them, but it also precludes their children who are born here of having a phenomenal life as well. So what does that say? Their children then can't, maybe if they're underage and they're accompanied by an adult, to go to a healthcare provider. Can they still get the same amount of resources? Will that healthcare provider be able to explain something to them and their family? You know, if they're limited to health insurance, what non-health insurance plans can they be given for access to contraception, for like endometriosis awareness, PCOS awareness, like if a young person gets diagnosed, and then what from there? So a lot of things preclude them, language being the biggest one, but I think just like cultural barriers, them not having communities, and then consistently being one of like the demographics in the lowest socioeconomic sector. A lot of things. That was a very loaded question and answer, but that's, yeah, it's the baseline of it.
Thank you, Kenya. Ms. Charlie, what can be done to empower women to make informed decisions about their reproductive health, free from coercion and discrimination?
A lot can be done. I think the biggest thing is creating safe spaces for women. Like I said, it really takes having a community of people that understand that they have needs, and know that they come from different backgrounds. And so having a community that, you know, allows for them to speak up and share their experiences, it helps for them to have a better opportunity at being fairly represented. As well, a really big thing that should be done is along with that, is discussing how intersectionality of our culture, our day-to-day lives, and our financial and social status connects to the way that we're able to receive care. I think a big thing that I appreciate from both of you is that education is very necessary. People in most communities, especially in the Black and Latina community, they don't really know that much about, you know, how to get certain services, how to speak up about things that they might be experiencing health-wise. And a large part of that is being able to find resources where they can receive that proper education. I'd also say, like, just destigmatizing reproductive care. When people say the word repro, the immediate thing is to talk about abortion, and abortion is not a bad thing. Abortion is healthcare. But as well, you want to make sure that you're including things like going to get mammogram, being screened, STD testing. All of those things are essential to having a healthy life. So I would say just making sure that you're opening up to having a community where you can actually listen to each other and find ways to, you know, debunk stigmas.
Thank you. Kenya, in what ways do language barriers contribute to the marginalization of Latin immigrant women, and what strategies can be employed to overcome these barriers?
Thank you for that question. I spoke about this in the previous question, but I think there's the language barriers continue to marginalize Latinas, immigrant Latinas, mostly because there is no language justice in this country. And so until we truly start treating this country like if it's a place that doesn't have an official language, I think we're still gonna have the same inadequate access to resources that we currently have, with them being in monolingual English, with them only being in certain settings. You know, I think that yeah, I talked about that earlier. What I think some strategies that can be employed to overcome these barriers, I think inclusion, that sounds like so, I don't know, but inclusion being one, simply because you can go into so many clinics and you won't see even like, it sounds rudimentary, but it's really the truth. Like you won't even see like pamphlets or flyers maybe in a language that's for you, that you can understand. And then on top of that, it's really just simplifying the info so that it's digestible. We've often had to make, like just at Latina Institute, we've had to make like a lot of infographics and flyers that we feel that our community can also understand, right? Like we don't just want to create things and like speak in like really big sentences that don't make sense and a lot of like medical terms. Like we want to be able to disseminate information to our community in ways that they can understand, and so we want to do that in a way that honors them, and we want to do that in a way that's culturally competent, and we want to do that in a way where people that are like me, I'm Latina, that give them this information so it doesn't feel like, you know, someone else is giving it to them and it's just like, oh, well, we're doing this for your community. Like, no, like you want people that like share their same demographics, that share their same values, that share their same beliefs and upbringings, to talk to them about this information because you can connect with them on a personal level. And so I think that the biggest way and one of the main ways to strategies to overcoming these barriers is to really have people that are like me in our communities. You know, I'm from Norfolk, you know, to go to communities in Norfolk and Virginia Beach, to where I grew up, and talk to people and have honest conversations that they've been mentioning, and do it in a way that honors these communities and respects them, and talks to them in monolingual Spanish, in ways, once again, that honors them. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but I've just also seen just a lot of people that do it just kind of to do it, or to be in the community and to say that they talk to someone in Spanish, or to say that they helped a community, but to do it in a way that is genuine and that doesn't miss the mark, I think it has to be intentional. I think that's one of the biggest ways to overcome it.
Thank you. Charlie, what legislative measures can be taken to address barriers to accessing reproductive health care services, particularly for marginalized communities?
I think the biggest thing is passing a constitutional amendment that protects all reproductive rights, not just abortion. I think as well, like I said, bringing community together. A huge thing that we're trying to do within the Hampton Roads area is like definitely bring people from different backgrounds together so that they can learn about what's going on legislative-wise, seeing how they feel about these policies that are being presented, and just the different ways that maybe we can all work together as a collective to, you know, find a resolution and also present it to our representatives. Another thing is really involving the youth. I know here I have a Gen Act chapter for Planned Parenthood. They do amazing work. I don't know if you are familiar.
I'm gonna find out.
But they do plenty of events on campus, you know, just to teach about what's going on my side of things with advocacy, teach about, you know, sexual health, stigmas, and also they have a repro hotline, different things that they do to try to like bring people together. I think the biggest thing that they're taking away is becoming even more involved legally. I've been able to get a lot of young people to come up to, you know, our Capitol and talk to their representatives and tell them why their reproductive rights matter. I think a lot of times people overshadow the youth, and they don't see that in the long run, the decision that you're making today impacts the livelihoods of everybody. So.
Thank you. Kenya, how can we ensure that the voices and experiences of Latin immigrant women are included and prioritized in discussions and decision-making processes related to immigration policies and women's rights?
Great question. Much like Charlie said, I think that legislative advocacy is first and foremost. I think that especially in these times, like everyone, not just Latinas, but everyone should be steadfast in their approach to advocating, being really comfortable to know who your legislators are, not just like federal senators and stuff, but local legislators, you know, who's in these meetings, like with your state senators, with your state delegates, helping to make some of these decisions. I think that's absolutely top of mind. I think constitutional amendment is like one of the biggest ways that we'll be able to get a lot of like that encompassing language to be able to get a lot of the rights that we want. And I also think it's in other legislation right now. I think that voting is supremely important. Also going with legislative advocacy, because we're not going to see all of these advances that we want in the legislature until we get the pro-abortion or pro-reproductive freedom majority that we want in there. And so in order to do that, we really have to be knowledgeable and get out the vote efforts and seeing what our local senators and delegates are doing, how the Virginia General Assembly is panning out, and what those individual caucuses within that General Assembly are looking like, because so many of these people sit in rooms and make decisions for the entire constituencies of Virginia. And we really, like as advocates, because we're all advocates, not even because of where we work, but just generally, like we're Virginia residents, like we are all advocates, and we should be up in Richmond pressing these people to lobby on our behalf. Like, I'll give an example. Our org, along with Planned Parenthood and other orgs, advocated to pass the Contraceptive Equity Act, which would have provided the full range of birth control options at no extra cost to patients, which would basically mirror federal law. That's all we're trying to do in Virginia, is basically mirror federal law, because even on private health insurance plans in Virginia, you cannot have the full range of birth control options that you want. You have to get an exemption from a doctor. And if you are on Medicaid in Virginia, which it just opened up to over 400,000 people in Virginia that could get Medicaid, you can't, if you want an exemption, it's gonna be tough. And so that's what we were facing. We presented it again this year through the legislature again, and it passed the full chamber, but we got a veto back from the governor. So like that just tells you, it doesn't just, we have to be supremely aware of what's going on. We have to be very in tune to what our legislators are doing and what the governor's doing, because even if we get a majority in the House and Senate, people need to show up to gubernatorial elections too. And it might seem stressful that in Virginia there's an election every month, but case in point, we just tried to pass a Contraceptive Equity Act that delegates and senators both passed in their chambers, but then the governor vetoed it, and then that was it. And so like, what do we do from there, right? Like, how can we push forward from that? We presented the constitutional amendment last year, it failed. So like, people need to be aware of that. People need to know that like, yes, like I know a lot of people are disillusioned with voting at the federal level, but there's so much more than Joe Biden and Trump. Like, I promise you, like, there's so much going on in Virginia, and like being a critical access point in the South, like we're the only state in the South that doesn't have a ban on abortion. Like, our 16 clinics are like the little engine that could. So, and for all of the other services that they provide, like, they don't just do abortions and Planned Parenthood, they do mammograms and STD checks and things like that. So, it's a lot of like small clinics, indie clinics, and funders like HRRJL's in here that are like doing God's work here, and we're trying, but it's like supremely important that people be involved in legislative advocacy.
Thank you, Kenya. Charlie, how can we engage men and boys as allies in promoting gender equality and reproductive rights?
I'd say, just again, creating communities where we can all learn from each other. As Dr. Bell and Dr. Litter mentioned, talking about like just the stigmas that we were taught over time. I think it's incredibly important for men, especially, to recognize the role that they play in a lot of the ways that we end up feeling, and the way that decisions are being made federally and especially in our local and state government. I think a huge part of it is just recognizing that you don't know everything and that there's always room for improvement. The biggest thing is advocating as well. You're not just advocating for yourself, you're advocating for those around you. So I think that's the biggest thing.
Thank you. Ms. Kenya, what role do grassroots organizations and community network plays in advocating for the rights of Latin immigrant women, and how can they be better supported and resourced?
Yeah, I think that grassroots organizations are at the very core of all of the organizing and advocacy that's done in the state. I think it's extremely important to support them. Just to give an example, I mentioned that in Virginia, just as an abortion example, because that's the work I do, there are 16 abortion clinics in Virginia, and we have no state-run abortion funds. So what that means is that there's a lot of indie abortion funds that come together to provide supplemental funds to folks who can't afford an abortion. And Amy can tell you this because Amy's also here later, but like people go through that money in the state quickly. And so first and foremost, I mean, like legislative advocacy is what's going to carry us through, but now, because like people, obviously legislative advocacy is great, and like we should keep lobbying in order to get the action that we want for years to come, right? But for right now, like, because I think that's what people are most worried about, like what services and resources can I get now? I think it's so important to donate to a local abortion fund. I will literally say that ad nauseum. Donate to abortion funds. I don't even know what it costs now because I think the price has skyrocketed, but like from what I remember, I think the lowest costing abortion is like $550 or something like that, and I could be totally off the margin there. It could have gone up. And a lot of people can't afford that. I mean, NPR came out with a study that the most amount that people have in their savings account right now in inflation, I think, is $400. So, yeah, I think we should all give to abortion funds. I think that we should be supporting them since there's no state-run facility that's going to give them money. They're not going to fund an abortion. I mean, they're trying to take people's rights away. And so I think that we should be supporting these organizations that are doing very, very hard work. Hampton Roads Reproductive Justice League, I keep talking about them, but they're literally tabling out, giving out free Plan B. Like so much, like their whole table is covered with Plan B. And that's what these orgs do. So I think that we should be donating to orgs that can give direct services and resources right now. Like we do a lot of education and advocacy, which is great because we're creating a lot of things in monolingual Spanish for people that can't read it otherwise. But like to people that need a Plan B right now, to people that need an STD check right now, we should support them and we should be going to them and we should be helping fuel them because they're going to carry us through in these communities, especially in the South. So donate to abortion funds. Visit other clinics that could be providing services that, you know, might need the numbers to go up. Like I get STD checks at the LGBT Life Center. Yeah, just continue to use local resources and pour back into them because it's the only way that like we're gonna stay community run.
Thank you. That concludes the first half of our panel discussion, but don't go too far. The second half of our panel discussion will begin at 8, followed by a brief Q&A. Welcome back everyone to the second half of our panel discussion. Let's introduce the new powerhouse of panelists. We'll start from my left to right and have you all introduce yourself and the organizations that you all represent.
Sorry. Thank you. So I'm Dr. Mary Ojo Cairns. I am a cosmetic gynecologist, board certified in OB/GYN. My practice is Climax Aesthetic Surgery. We practice sexual medicine, sexual health for both men and women, and we're in Virginia Beach.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy Pasqua. I'm with our local abortion fund, Hampton Roads Reproductive Justice League. That's a mouthful, so we say HRRJL for short. We fund abortions for people living in and more often now traveling to the Hampton Roads region. And we do what we can to help normalize abortion as essential health care and to end the stigma.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. My name is Brianna Diaz. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm the Policy and Legislative Counsel for ACLU of Virginia, the American Civil Liberties Union, or as some of our biggest fans call us, the Anti-American Communist Litigation Underworld. I wear that as a badge of honor. But we are our affiliate is about 60 years old, but an over 100-year-old civil rights and civil liberties organization, multi-issue. I lead our reproductive freedom and LGBTQ rights work, but we fight for all Virginians, but in particular marginalized Virginians impacted by systems of oppression and issues we'll talk about more tonight.
Hey everyone, my name is Julie Snell, she, her pronouns. I am a director at the LGBT Life Center. I oversee housing, mental health, and youth services. The LGBT Life Center has been serving Hampton Roads for over 35 years. We do sexual health and wellness. Housing services have been in place the whole time, mental health services, youth, senior services. Anything that you can put in front of services, we probably do it. And I'm very excited to be here tonight, so thank you.
Thank you all. Once again, I'd like to establish some guidelines and ensure productive conversation. We encourage open dialogue, respect for different perspectives, and active listening. Please be mindful of time to allow all panelists to contribute, and I'll also reserve time at the end for questions from the audience towards the end. Each question posed will be given 3 minutes to be answered. To kick off our discussion, let's begin with the foundational question. What does women's rights mean to each of you personally, and why do you think it's essential for our society? And we will start with you, Dr. Ojo.
I mean, it's probably a cliche because people, I think, said it also in the beginning, so you hear this oftentimes, but women's rights is human rights. I mean, it's just a basic right, you know. There's not a way that the society can continue if not half of the society has the right or the ability to live in the way they want to live. And each home is somehow impacted by a woman. Each of us here came from a woman. And so however you identify as a woman, those rights are just endemic in society, and society actually moving forward. And so human rights, women's rights, they're one and the same.
Yeah, +1 to what Dr. Ojo said and what everyone else on the first panel said. Women's rights are human rights. What is the adage that you're only as strong as your weakest section. You're only as strong as the weakest people in your community are protected. So women's rights are everyone's rights, and if you don't have autonomy over your body, then you have nothing in this world. So until we have 100% bodily autonomy and rights just like every other rich white man out there, then it's, you know, women's rights are equally human rights.
Yeah, this is a hard question to keep in less than a minute, but I appreciate it. I think for me, women's rights has always been rooted in the concept of bodily autonomy, right? Like we can conceptualize or familiar with the historical growth of at least like America's like women's rights movement, rooted in accessing the ballot box, accessing and being able to get a divorce, being able to open a bank account. It can be economic rights, social rights. I mean, it spans the whole gambit of our lives and how we operate in the various spaces we occupy. But at its very core and root, I believe it's bodily autonomy, the ability to make decisions for oneself, and to be empowered by systems for you to make those decisions. And very much that root, I think, also feeds into like LGBTQ rights, which then feeds into like our liberation, which I know we'll unpack more in our questions. But I think regardless of the name you put in front of it, like it comes down to bodily autonomy and decision making for yourself.
Yeah, so for me, women's rights means that anytime a decision is being made about a woman's body, about her mind, about her rights, any of those things, that a woman is actually at the table to participate in that conversation. That there's a seat at the table for women, and not just white women, right? Not just cisgender white women. It's a seat at the table for all women to actually participate in that conversation about our rights and everything that goes with that.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Now let's delve deeper into specific topics. Please note that the following questions are grouped by segments but will be examined in various orders. Please look for the projected screens on either side of the stage with each segmented question. First segments will be the LGBTQ. For this segment, we'll be having Ms. Brianna and Julie take the leads. Brianna, we'll start with you. Ms. Brianna, how do legal frameworks for women's rights accommodate or neglect the rights of the LGBTQ individuals, and what changes are needed to ensure comprehensive protection and equality?
All right, I got 3 minutes, right?
All right, you got it.
Law school in 3 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I think, so I think I'll start with how do legal frameworks for women's rights intersect with or inform LGBTQ rights? And I think what we have seen is, are folks familiar with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, establishing non-discrimination in employment on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, and sex? So that's actually the first enumeration of non-discrimination protections for sex, which provided protections for women, right? Because women were facing disproportionate discrimination in the workforce. They weren't getting jobs, they were getting lower paid jobs, as they continue to do today. And so that was seen as one of the legal frameworks to challenge that. And so absent at the federal level, but here in Virginia at least, absent at the federal level are non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people or sexual orientation and gender identity, right? But what we've done at the federal level is that we have key federal case law that has interpreted sex, non-discrimination on the basis of sex in Title VII or Title IX of the Education Amendments to say that sex includes sexual orientation and gender identity, right? Because when you discriminate against someone based on their sex, you're also assuming their sexual orientation. You're also assuming that gender identity is usually a cisgender person who is a man, identifies as a man and operates in the world as a man. But we know that not to be true, right? There's non-binary people like me. There's transgender people in this world who are not, defined by their birth assigned as sex. And so one of the most recent Supreme Court decisions was Bostock in 2020 that had to do with transgender people and cisgender gay people losing their employment because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And the US Supreme Court made very clear in their decision in Bostock that discrimination on the basis of sex encompasses discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that is a foundational case that we are now seeing inform other various federal cases providing explicit protections for LGBTQ people. The unfortunate thing, though, is that there is now this growing moral panic against transgender and non-binary people in the form of women's rights, in the form of bills like Save Women's Sports, that are relying on biological essentialism, that is defining sex as biological based on your chromosomes, which we all know there's not just 2 chromosomes, but there's variations in chromosomes to represent intersex people. Oh man. And so essentially what we're seeing is a rollback of women's rights, a misinterpretation of sex, and a misinterpretation, an absolute erasure of the LGBTQ experience by trying to define sex to exclude sexual orientation and gender identity and to link it directly to your reproductive organs, the external or internal, to your chromosomes. And what that is doing is that it is removing rights and protections for LGBTQ people and making transgender women and girls in particular targets of oppressive legislation and policy. I could go into more about that, but I only have 3 minutes. But I think we are seeing how this root of non-discrimination in sex has protected LGBTQ people, but is now being weaponized to oppress us and erase us. And so that's something to be mindful as we talk about sex discrimination and women's rights.
Thank you so much, Brianna. Julie, what unique challenges do LGBTQ women face in terms of reproductive rights, health care, and family planning, and how can these challenges be addressed?
This is longer than 3 minutes. No. There's a lot to unpack in this question, right? And we've said that about every question. But for me, when we're looking at the unique challenges that LGBTQIA plus women face in terms of reproductive rights, healthcare, family planning, and how those challenges can be addressed, we have to first acknowledge youth. So LGBTQIA plus youth experience the highest rates of suicide, the highest rates of mental health, of bullying, and all of that stuff impacts their long-term mental health. It impacts LGBTQI plus youth have the highest rates of cancer in the long term. They have rates of obesity. There is all of these health disparities that start at the youth level because of their experiences. So when we're thinking about not just LGBTQIA plus women, but we have to think about the children as well, because they're going to turn into the women that are going to experience this crisis. And this crisis of health impacts everybody, not just queer folks. So acknowledging that when we're talking about reproductive rights and healthcare, I like to talk about our experiences with doctors in general, where you go to a doctor and you don't feel represented in the waiting room. You don't see people that look like you. You don't see paperwork that is inclusive of your identity because they're saying, circle, male or female, and you're like, well, like that doesn't quite work for me, and it doesn't acknowledge the rate of intersex folks in the community. There's so much that goes into this that you don't feel included in this space, you don't feel included on the paperwork. Why am I going to come back and seek healthcare? Why am I going to try to take care of myself when we know the disparities in this? LGBTQI plus people experience the highest rates of sexually transmitted diseases. They experience the highest rates of HIV. And all of this is preventative. Like we can have services to prevent this from happening. We have the resources for it. We have everything in healthcare, except when we go and talk to doctors, they're not listening. When I talk to my doctor as a queer woman and they say, oh, well, like when was your last sexual activity with a man? And I'm just like, not recent. But we have to acknowledge that they're not, healthcare isn't inclusive. Healthcare isn't inclusive of folks, particularly when we start to consider intersectionality, right? Black women experience the highest rates of mortality when giving birth. Queer Black women experience even higher rates of disparities in this. So we have to acknowledge, again, not just about being queer, but about your identity wrapped all into that. Intersectionality is a big piece. So how can we address these challenges? I think the start of it is having these conversations, the open dialogue, being an advocate. When you hear folks are suffering, you hear them saying that they can't find a doctor that's affirming, when they can't access the health care that they need, helping navigate that. When you see paperwork at an office that isn't inclusive, say something. Say like, oh, why is this binary? Why do you need this information? I say things all the time. I'm a nightmare, like in a healthcare setting. And it's because somebody has to say something. My job as in the community is to be an ally for everyone and to advocate for myself as well. And that's kind of the stance that we have to take. If we're looking at it at the individual level, we can always say something. When we're looking at it at a macro level, so we're talking about more people, it's actually taught, like, you know, it's going out and voting. It's, this year alone, and like, again, we're in April, right? There have been over 400 laws introduced to limit the rights of queer folks, particularly queer women, trans women, all of those things. So we have to go out and vote, and we have to have these conversations.
Thank you, Julie. Brianna, in what ways do the challenges faced by women in pursuit of their rights intersect with the challenges encountered by members of the LGBT community?
Yeah, I mean, our oppression is interlinked in almost every way. You know, what comes to mind, because it just feels timely, is a lot of the focus on stripping away of women's rights and LGBTQ people rights is rooted again in that erasure of bodily autonomy. That can look like the form of the Dobbs decision out of the Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade, where we lost the fundamental rights to abortion. Following the fall of Dobbs, we have seen every single state in the South, except for Virginia, prohibit or severely restrict abortion. But those attacks on healthcare, because that's what it is, it's reproductive healthcare, like plain and simple. You know, it's not limited to abortion. We're seeing, you know, in the Alabama Supreme Court finding that IVF is rooted in life and that there are limitations on forms of it and access to it. We've seen the Arizona Supreme Court interpret a 1864 law to prohibit abortion. I mean, we're seeing our reproductive health care under attack. And even though we are lucky in Virginia in the sense that those efforts are not successful here, they are happening here. They are happening, like I think just this past year, we saw, or actually in 2023, we saw, I think it was 16 anti-abortion bills introduced, some all like complete bans, some of them being 15-week bans, but they exist. And so that's kind of trying to paint the picture of attacks against abortion. You could actually map on top of that map, another one about gender affirming care bans. Virginia is about to be, if it's not already, the only state that hasn't restricted or prohibited gender-affirming care for trans and non-binary minors, as well as young adults, all right? Just 2 years ago in 2023, we had 4 gender-affirming care bans introduced. Not all of them were limited to minors. Some extended all the way to 21 years of age and younger. And again, at the root of this is moral panic, attempts to strip the bodily autonomy away from marginalized people. But the fortunate thing, I guess, is that we are successful in Virginia of defeating those legislative efforts. but that is only because I think what people have touched on is that, we are lucky in a sense to have a pro reproductive freedom and pro LGBTQ right General Assembly. We have a hostile executive and the governor, and so that General Assembly is the only thing preventing those atrocious bills from reaching his desk, because he has demonstrated since day one that his agenda is to take those rights and your bodily autonomy away from you. And so it's why it's so important, I think, to know what is happening in the General Assembly, to stay involved, to show up and oppose the legislation like this, because again, we are the last access state for LGBTQ people, the last access state when it comes to reproductive health care, and that intersection is just erasure of bodily autonomy.
Thank you so much. Julie, discuss the roles of allies in advocating for the rights of both women and LGBTQ individuals. How can individuals and communities work together to create a more inclusive and equitable society?
Raise your hand if you've heard of the LGBT Life Center. And if that was before today. So some folks still before today. So I think that's a big thing. But how many of you have heard of any of the trans agencies serving Hampton Roads? Can you name a few of them? Tap. Who was here?
STRC.
STRC, yes.
Coalition.
Yep, Hands Coalition. So those are a few agencies that most folks haven't heard of, and they're so important in this fight, recognizing that all women deserve rights, all LGBTQIA plus individuals deserve rights. And when we're thinking about discussing the roles of allies and advocating for the rights of women and LGBTQIA plus folks, and you're looking at it at the individual level, it's education. Know these things, know how to share a resource. Support that resource if you have the opportunity. Most of these agencies, particularly trans-serving agencies or trans-led agencies, don't get money donated to them. They don't get the resources to help the community that is in desperate need. So you can support them by talking about them, you can support them by donating, you can support them by volunteering. If it's something that you care about, say something, get involved. And I think that at the individual level, we can all just one of the things that is most valuable is giving our time. Volunteering, giving a little bit of your time, talking about it. Those are ways that you can help be the best ally. And then at the community level and working together, it's attending events like this. It's having these conversations. It's going to the Pride events, right? And talking to people and being visibly out there, because it's not always safe to be visible in the community. It's not always safe to be a queer woman. It's not always safe to be visibly trans. It's not always safe to be non-binary and to share your pronouns. And I have a lot of folks ask this question oh, why do you share your pronouns? You're cisgender. I share my pronouns because then the next person might feel comfortable sharing theirs. And maybe this is the first time they've felt like they could share their pronouns. Create a safe space for people. Be a safe space. I don't have a lot of money to put into things, but I have time, and I have the ability to be comforting, the ability to be a person that people can approach. And then, again, just being visibly in the community. Going out and voting, that's going to be the thing that y'all are going to take out of this. When I teach and lecture, I'm like, please take one thing out of my class, and it's this. Tonight, it's take the voting out of this. It's not just about big elections, it's about the little ones too. The General Assembly being the thing that is protecting our rights right now from a governor that does not care about most people's rights in this room. Just thinking about that. And like I said, just if you want to create an inclusive and equitable society, it starts within you. It starts in your actions and the things that you do and the things that you say and how you operate within this world. You can make somebody feel comfortable and safe with a smile by complimenting the shoes that they're wearing, just telling them they look great today. And those seem like small things, but you have no idea how deeply they impact a person's comfort and their mental health in a lot of ways.
Thank you. Brianna, discuss the intersectionality of race, gender, and sexual orientation. How do these factors compound challenges for women in the LGBTQ community, and how can advocacy address these intersecting issues?
Yeah, actually, as you were asking, I had prepped an answer to this, and it just went out of my head. So, so way to go, 8:20 p.m. me. Yeah, so I feel like Julie's touched on this a little bit in one of her answers, touching on how, when we talk about LGBTQ rights and women's rights, we have to ensure that we're talking about it, looking at it, via like an intersectional lens, because the unfortunate reality is that, BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color who are also LGBTQ are disproportionately impacted by discriminatory laws or just culturally incompetent environments, whether it be healthcare, whether it be child placing agencies, like when you're trying to, form your family. In the workspace, like truly there are so many spaces that, queer folks occupy that are not exactly friendly or welcoming to them. And that is exacerbated, I think, in, when you include race and other identifying factors. And so when I think about how can advocacy address these intersecting issues, as the policy and legislative person, I like to think about policy solutions, but those are never the only solutions. Don't ever think your issue is going to be solved with policy, because policy is only as powerful as it is enforced, and those who enforce it may not always be your friends, or they may be seeking to repeal that policy. Dobbs and Roe. But I'll think of a couple bills. I know this past legislative session, there have been attempts to enact legislation requiring cultural competency training for medical providers. That legislation was led by an amazing group called Birth and Color. I hope you've heard of them before, but if not, you're hearing about them now. And they push for equitable medical practices, particularly for Black women, trans and cisgender in Virginia, and they have been behind an amazing bill that would require cultural competency for medical providers, nurse practitioners, etc., to address, how racism and anti-Blackness and anti-queerness and transphobia shows up in medical settings, so that those that are treating us actually know how to treat us. Because I think you've touched on this. If we don't trust our healthcare providers, we're not going to return there, and then that leads to the outcomes, right, of higher HIV rates, of higher STIs, and other low other impacts impacting our physical and mental and emotional well-being and health. And so there have been policy solutions like that. I believe that bill did make it out of the General Assembly. I believe it's on Governor Youngkin's desk. I can't remember if he signed it, because he's either vetoed or amended all of our other reproductive health care bills this year, because, why not? But I think that's just one example of where we can institute policy changes to create affirming environments that would have a meaningful impact for LGBTQ folks of color, low-income folks, and others.
Thank you. Julie, addressing violence against women is a crucial aspect of women's rights. How does violence affect LGBTQ women, and what measures can be taken to ensure their safety and protection?
I was really excited when this question was chosen for me, because I definitely responded back and said, pick whatever questions you want for me. My PhD is in criminology. I am obsessed with talking about this topic. I teach on gender, sexuality, and crime all the time. One of the things for me is when we're talking about violence against women, it's so important that we talk about how it impacts them, but most people just don't know anything about this topic. So bisexual and pansexual women experience the highest rates of intimate partner violence. Followed then by transgender women. And largely, I think trans women experience the higher rates. We just don't have the statistics on it because the research isn't there. But first acknowledging that when you're talking about this, bisexual and pansexual women experience high rates of intimate partner violence, largely cannot access resources because they are either turned away from queer affirming resources or turned away from those straight resources based on the relationship that they are in. So if they are in a heterosexual presenting relationship, folks think they're straight and they aren't able to access the queer resources. If they're in a queer presenting relationship, they are turned away from the straight resources. So it becomes this huge issue that there's opportunity for access to care and you get turned away. The other part of this is that Black trans women experience the highest rates of intimate partner homicide and the lowest rates of cases that are solved. Meaning that when they are murdered, their cases go unsolved, that nobody gets prosecuted for that. And these numbers are devastating for the community. So like I said, when I like to talk about violence against women, we talk about the violence that is occurring and the statistics behind that. How does that affect LGBTQIA+ women? Women in general don't feel safe. We're leaving here tonight and it's dark outside. I'm going to be sure that I walk with somebody. Women are raised and taught to always look around, check the back seat of your car, carry something with you, have somebody on the phone, never walk alone, all of these things stacked up. And then particularly if you are a trans woman that's walking out there and you are noticeably trans and you're afraid of your victimization. And when you are just queer women just trying to exist in a space together, when I go out with my girlfriend and I have to constantly be worried, am I going to be victimized today? Like, is somebody going to verbally victimize me or physically? And that some places just aren't safe to do that. Thinking about in Virginia particularly, we've talked about a lot of the protections that are still existing here, but there are parts of Virginia that are still sundown towns. There are parts of Virginia that you cannot be openly queer in. And we have to be thinking about that at all times. So not only am I thinking about the safety as a woman, I'm also thinking about my safety as a queer woman and what that looks like. So this is all compounding, right? All these parts of my identity are coming together to create an environment where I just don't always feel safe. So what can we do to ensure our safety and protections? I don't know, I just talked to you all about like never walk alone, carry your keys, like be on the phone with your best friend, have your location shared with somebody. Those are the things that we all individually do, right? But when we're talking about how we ensure the safety and protections, it goes back to being a safe person, keeping those around you safe, recognizing that someone you care about is a woman, someone that you care about is queer, somebody you care about is probably a queer woman. Make them feel comfortable and safe with you. Make them feel comfortable and safe. Don't tell me you love me and then go and vote for policies that limit my rights. Don't tell me that you care about me and then make decisions that are going to long-term impact my ability to live safely in this world. So I think that it just comes down to, if we're talking about safety and protection, be a safe person and protect my rights.
Thank you, Judith. Brianna, discuss the impact of discriminatory laws and policies on the mental health and well-being of LGBTQ women. How can legal reform contribute to a more inclusive and supportive society?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to answer that. Thank you for saying everything you just said about safety and intersectionality, about queer women-ness, and like whether you choose to disclose. I feel like a lot of queer people are familiar with that. And like, just like funny story is my wife has gray hair. She's had gray hair since she's 12. And our form of safety is they'll be like, is that your mom and are you the daughter? And I'm like, this is a fun thing, should we kiss now? But anyways, like, you choose to disclose or you can't disclose, but it's a real thing. Like, every day people come out and they choose safety sometimes over being openly who you are, but I like to mess with people, so. But yeah, discuss the impact of discriminatory laws and policies on mental health. So I wrote down just a couple data points because I just can't remember data, but you know, I'm gonna root my response in this in education, because right now in Virginia, we have a governor, as we've mentioned, Governor Youngkin, whose platform has been to just completely destroy our public education system, whether it's through divisive concepts, executive orders that are censoring corrupt classroom curriculum that teaches, you know, true history and the lived experiences of Black, Brown, LGBTQ folks, whether it's book banning. He's also pushed for model policies that, anti-transgender model policies that forcibly out transgender youth, deny them their autonomy and being called their affirming names and pronouns and other just absolutely horrendous things. And we are already seeing, like we already knew prior to those model policies, that LGBTQ youth are more likely to face bullying, discrimination, and harassment in school settings. But with these model policies, you are only exacerbating those outcomes or those experiences. And so, for example, we know that there's this national organization called GLSEN, that's an LGBTQ rights and education organization. They have a school climate survey they conduct every other year, and Virginia's recently came out. And GLSEN found that in Virginia, more than 1 in 2 LGBTQ students in Virginia experienced some form of bullying in their school, more than 1 in 2. In 2019, the Virginia Department of Health released data, and 72% of Virginia students in public schools said they had experienced bullying. That was 2019, that was 2022, both years before the anti-transgender model policies came out. Since they've come out, we are hearing daily how horrible some education systems, schools have been for youth, because like they now can't tell their teacher when they need help. Like literally the model policies prohibit LGBTQ youth from going to their school counselor and saying, I think I'm trans or I am transgender and I need access to mental health services. If you are a young person and you go to your school counselor with that request, the school counselor says, stop, I have to call your parents first and tell them that you told me this and get their acceptance or approval before I can offer you that mental health service. I don't know about y'all, but like I came out at 13 years old, as 20 years ago, and my family was not supportive. When I came out, I lost my home. I barely graduated from school, and I was forcibly outed. And I can tell you how damaging that is for my mental health, my well-being. That's still something that like we have to work through. And I can only imagine how hard it is for youth today to have to experience that. And so, that is an example of a discriminatory law and policy that's impacting the mental health of LGBTQ youth, and in particular trans girls and women in school settings. We've also seen, you touched on this in the past, couple, 3 years. Every year we've seen nearly 400 anti-transgender bills, anti-LGBTQ, but overwhelmingly anti-transgender bills introduced in states. And those also foster a hostile climate towards trans youth, right? Just in the past year, hate crimes in schools has quadrupled. Why? Because of the narrative and community, what we're setting up for youth to be targeted, to be told that they are less than, that they don't deserve anything, and that they should feel unsafe for being who they are. So that's what's happening. But what we are doing to contribute to a more inclusive and supportive environment is, as you can imagine, the ACLU of Virginia is suing the Virginia Department of Education for those anti-transgender model policies. We have 2 cases, one in York County, one in Hanover County right now, challenging those model policies. We also have defeated, just the past session, 14 anti-transgender bills were introduced in Virginia last year, this past session. And we were successful in defeating them due to the amazing partners on the stage, and many that I'm sure you're aware of that aren't here today. But those successes are, again, due to who we have in the General Assembly, and who is having those, I think, conversations to sway hearts and minds, because that to me is more powerful than any policy or bill, legislative, platform could be. Anyways, that's what we're seeing, that's what we're doing. But to ensure that these 2023 model policies cease to exist, y'all, you've got to vote in the 2025 election. Our entire House of Delegates is up, the governor is up, and we got to ensure that the people that we place in those seats of power affirm transgender youth, not attack them and use them as a personal political platform.
And I just want to add a little bit to that, because touched on LGBTQI plus youth being bullied. It's so important, because when I was in school, I went home and the bullying stopped. But in 2024, you don't go home and the bullying stops. The bullying turns to social media. So you left the building, but now on Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, various other things. I don't think kids use Facebook, but all of these social media apps, kids are continuing to bully them. So you didn't escape that. You went home to what should be a safe space, and it might not be a safe space with your parents, and you're still being bullied. So we are seeing such a high rate of LGBTQI plus youth suicide because of this. They can't get away from this. So when you can't get affirming care at school, and you can't be get affirming services at home, and the state is out to get you with all of these policies and laws, what do you do? And so many of these kids are turning to suicide, and we are losing a whole group of kids to this. So something has to change. And a big part of that is policies. We've talked about the voting, all of those things are so important, but also finding safe spaces to access services in the community. The LGBT Life Center offers youth counseling because of this. We offer a youth group, so you do have one space where you can be safe. And that has to be replicated across other agencies and programs, is creating safe spaces for people.
Thank you. Thank you both so much, Julie and Brianna, for highlighting some of the ways that members of the LGBTQ community can be missed when discussing women's rights and issues, and what more needs to be done to ensure that they are seen and protected. Next, we will move over to the second portion of our reproductive and health segment, started with Dr. Ojo. How can policymakers and advocates work to address systemic barriers that prevent women from accessing the reconstructive surgery they need to address reproductive health issues?
Thank you for this question.
You're welcome.
I think it's not the policymakers. Policy is made by demand. And the first thing that has to happen is there has to be a demand for equality of healthcare, right? And that comes from us as women. Again, however you're identifying as a woman. Us first knowing our bodies, and then also us appreciating our bodies, and then us demanding that our bodies function in a way that we can live our day-to-day the way we want that to happen. We have less than 4% of the US budget for science and education given towards women's health. So in what way are any advances going to happen? Policymakers follow money, okay? And so what also follows money is money being spent, right? And so there has to be a demand because in the household, most of us hold the budget. Most of us do the spending. And the spending is done on other things and other places other than ourselves. And so that also comes down to healthcare. So when I think about policymakers and advocates working to address systemic barriers, there's, in some ways, I really feel like we as women are barriers to ourselves because we're not holding ourselves up to the level that we need to be held up to move forward, right? We are holding so many other people in front of us. The other thing is just having more knowledge. I hear you all talking and the things that are going on in this world that are very heartbreaking, right? People dying, people being pushed out of homes, people not feeling like they can go to their doctors and say what they need to say to receive the care that they need. And part of that's just also the education of the person providing the care. Like in medical school, you're not getting that much education. That will help those who are seeking your services, right? When we are taught about the human body, we're really looking at one type of body for presented as a man, one type of body for presented as a woman, and that body doesn't even look like mine, right? So part of it is coming back to who's actually providing the care, and that person being educated to understand that this is an issue that they need to address.
Thank you so much. Ms. Amy, what policies are needed to protect and promote reproductive rights, including the rights to safe and legal abortion?
Right, so all of the policies that protect our clean air, water, and land and guarantee our bodily autonomy are needed to promote reproductive rights, including the right to safe, legal, and abortion. HRRJL is part of a statewide coalition, and the ACLU also, that wrote a constitutional amendment for reproductive freedom last year. Like Brianna mentioned, it passed in the legislative, the House and the Senate, because they're in the majority for liking that, and the governor vetoed that. And like Dr. mentioned, it starts with us demanding that stuff. It starts with us changing our language and our culture around what we believe is reproductive justice. It starts with changing our language from not being pro-choice, but being to pro-access. Understanding that abortion is an essential health care, that is an essential right, just like any kind of dentistry or any other kind of surgery that one would need or want. So the policies needed are the policies that we demand and that we write. And it's up to us to educate our legislators, right? Because they're the ones that write the policy. So it's up to us to inform them. It's up to us to make sure they have the right messaging, that they know what they're talking about, so that they can advocate for the policies that make it safe to promote reproductive rights, which includes abortion access and safe and legal abortion.
Thank you. You're actually up again, so keep it. Amy, how can grassroots movement and civil society organizations work together to advance reproductive justice for all women?
Right, so reproductive justice, again, is different. It's separate from reproductive rights. Okay, reproductive justice encompasses everything that anyone would want to live safely in a community. It involves not only bodily autonomy, but being able to make that choice for when and if you want to start a family and how. However you want to build that family and you want to live in dignity and safety, right? So it's going to take everything. It's going to take grassroots movements, and it's going to take policy movements. It's going to take culture change. It's going to take people understanding that we're not only fighting for women's rights, we're fighting for essential human rights. If you don't own your body, if you can't say how your life is going to go, if you're forced by the state to carry a child, you have no autonomy. And in 2024, that's unconscionable. Virginia has a really wonderful position to reverse the legacy of just stepping all over bodily autonomy since the first colonists stepped, on the soil. The constitutional amendment for reproductive freedom would help ensure abortion access, contraceptive access, sex education, and all that stuff. And that is not going to move forward unless we change how we feel about reproductive health care, including abortion, including contraception, including sex education. And that starts with our language, that starts with understanding there is no choice without having access. We can't say that we're pro-choice when millions of people in this country don't have the access to the choices. So it's going to take a bridging between the policy people and the grassroots people to push everything forward and to demand from our policymakers to use the right language to advocate for all people, not for a narrow swath of people, and to make it safe for us to live on Earth.
Thank you. Dr. Ojo, how does reconstructive surgery offered by cosmetic gynecologists contribute to restoring physical and emotional well-being for women who have experienced reproductive issues such as damage from childbirth or sexual trauma?
So, I was talking about this earlier. The pregnant woman, her physiology is completely different from the non-pregnant woman. Just like the non-pregnant woman that is still menstruating is different from, her physiology is different from the postmenopausal woman who's no longer menstruating. And so our bodies do go through a lot during pregnancy, not just from the birth of the child, but also just being pregnant itself. I mean, you've doubled your blood volume, you have changed the way your hormones act on your joints. I mean, it's just, your whole body has changed, your whole physiology has changed. And so your emotional health can also change too, When you experience a traumatic birth and a traumatic delivery, that could be as minor as having a tear on your labia. That could be as major as losing your uterus, right? And so having that reconstruction afterwards is oftentimes necessary just for that woman to function on her day-to-day, so she doesn't pee herself all the time, so her periods aren't crazy, and so she just feels emotionally well. A lot of times when we're just talking about like the external genitalia, it's not seen as a place that anyone wants to look at. There are many women that don't know what their labia look like, that don't know what their clitorises look like, what vagina looks like, right? And it's because our bodies are sexualized. And so for us to have confidence in who we are, that is diminished when we're very, very young to explore, right? And exploring doesn't do anything but educate you. So, how, let me come back to the question, sorry. So how does having that availability to have your body present in the way that you want it to present after you deliver, how does that help a woman just be a better person, or present the way she wants to? Because it actually helps a lot with the emotional well-being. Now, sexual trauma is a whole nother basket, right? But still, again, it's coming back to self-love. And so many women and men who have been victims of sexual trauma oftentimes have a level of self-hating of their bodies because their bodies were abused. And so being able to help them have that mental and physical connection, again, in which they are self-accepting, is really important for their longevity.
Thank you. Amy, how can we address disparities in maternal health care outcomes, particularly for women of color and low-income women?
Thank you for this question. Brianna touched on this when they mentioned Birth in Color, which is a very wonderful Black woman-led maternal health organization based out of Richmond, but serves all of Virginia. We just had a Black Maternal Health Week, April 11th through the 17th. I think it's like maybe the 7th or the 8th year that we've had it. And we have that to address the disparities in Black maternal health. It's anywhere from like 3.5 to, Black women will die 3.5 to 4 times more than white women during childbirth. Just recently in the news, I believe her name was Vanessa Anderson. She was a former cheerleader of, I think, the Chiefs, and she was also a programmer, and she made a program that helped to detect blood clots in women postpartum. And she also passed postpartum because of these discrepancies. You could be the richest Black woman in the world, Serena Williams. She had problems getting doctors listening to her about her blood clots. Some of these disparities, like I was getting around to, Brianna mentioned Birth and Color had their what was it, the cultural compensation. So as recent as 2016, 2014, I think a journalist broke the news that Charlottesville, University of Charlottesville was training their doctors that Black people felt pain differently than white people. Okay, that was 7-8 years ago that they're doing this. So generations of doctors have been trained that Black people, people of color, feel pain differently. Their bodies work differently than white people. So having those conversations with doctors, training them of how Black bodies work, having studies, all these medical studies are based on, white men mostly. So training doctors to understand these cultural things about people, making it safe for people to come to them, and for them understanding how bodies work, and also train them in compassion and trauma-informed care. That will definitely help have better outcomes for low-income women and people of color in marginalized communities.
Thank you. Dr. Ojo, what advancements have been made in the field of reconstructive surgery for reproductive health issues, and how do these developments improve patient outcomes?
Can I go back to that last question also?
Yes.
I'm sorry, just because since my training is to OB, our biggest problem in obstetrics now, for the ability to have more competency or have more physicians that come out as competent providers, not only the ability to provide medical care and deliver and do surgery, but to hear and understand their patient, is we're just not being educated to do that. We're being educated to do the procedure, but not see the person. And so having organizations directly go into residencies, not even on my level, I'm old, I'm out, residency programs where you're actually you're crafting your skill, school where you're learning the physiology, and talk to those generations of physicians that are coming out and making them informed from the beginning helps them as they're training, because most of our training programs are in academic centers that are in low-income areas. So for every physician that you see in Beverly Hills working and doing whatever surgery or doing whatever procedure, they were trained most likely in a low-income, had a low-income population that they were trained around. And so they have to learning how to identify with those that are truly in need, and not seeing, always seeing yourself above, I guess, definitely helps to move the needle forward. Because we're all human. It's not like we don't have compassion, right? But the field doesn't always necessarily allow us to exhibit that. And some people just don't know. And so educating from early on, I think, helps a lot. What advances have been made in the field of reconstructive surgery for reproductive health issues? There's a lot of new things out there for women. There's a ton of new things out there for women. Although the research is not behind us, although the FDA is not behind us, although CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, is not behind us in coverage, beyond just reconstructive surgery, there are a lot of things out there for women. There are new meds, there are new procedures, there are new things that can help us just as we age, so that we're not being put out to pasture. A man ages and he has gray hair, he's looked at as seasoned, and a woman has gray hair and we're out to pasture. You have women in their 40s being told, don't worry about having sex anymore, you're getting older. And that makes absolutely no sense, right? So there are new pharmaceuticals, new surgeries, new procedures, and one of the biggest things I am very passionate about is hormone replacement, hormone therapy. And for women, the use of testosterone has been something that has been taboo for years, right? After you become menopausal, even in your mid-30s, if you need it for libido, for stamina, for muscle mass, for brain clarity, for weight gain, all that, the use of testosterone has been looked down upon. Why? I have no idea, because we all produce it. We all need it. And so again, it comes down to who is the one who has historically done the educating, and who's the one that has historically made the recommendations. Who have the studies historically been on? And if we are bringing more people into the fold that don't, that are like here in this room, the more that we're able to say, okay, these advances are not just magic science, they're actually true science, and we're able to give it to those that need it.
Actually, you can keep it. Dr. Ojo, can you share any patient stories or testimonials that highlight the transformative impacts of reconstructive surgery on women's lives and self-esteem?
Yeah. So I've had, I actually told the story a couple of days ago. I had a patient that, so I do a lot of surgery for sexual satisfaction now, to improve sex, increase the libido, orgasm, so on and so forth, which is extremely important. I mean, sexual health is extremely important. Libido is extremely important. Orgasm is extremely important for cardiac health, mental health, physical health, everything, And so I had a patient who, mid-30s, she's had a couple of children, all vaginal, had a lot of stretching occur, and she could no longer have intimacy with her husband and feel satisfied. And the husband was not feeling satisfied either, just because the two of them, her body had changed. And she's on the verge of divorce from her husband. And so her surgery was something very simple, something extremely simple that helped her not only with self-satisfaction on her partner, but also helped her stop peeing herself all the time, Imagine, like you're sitting down at a conference and your seat is wet because you have incontinence because you had 3 babies. It is not an uncommon thing. I have another patient who is, she is in her 70s. She has a condition called lichen sclerosis, just completely changes the anatomy of the outside of the vagina. It's a very bad disease process, but something most women won't talk about because, who cares about down there, right? But changes her ability to, the clothes she can wear, the soap she can use, ability to use the restroom, and just her day-to-day, and let's not even talk about intimacy with her spouse that she's been with for 50 years. Something that is treatable with simple medications that are not expensive, but it's taking the time and having patience to treat this patient, and just a simple steroid helps her. So these are just two. But all this to say, part of it is normalizing conversations about the female body and it not being seen as being sexualized because sex is taboo, but then also normalizing the conversation about sex, because sex happens and sex should happen, and it is it's a physiologic process just like breathing, right? It is something that happens, and we should feel free to talk about it and free to talk about our experiences.
Next, we'll move to the vital portion of our program, one where many members of today's audience have the ability to help shape in our favor legislation. For this segment, we will once again welcome Brianna and Amy. Brianna, we're going to start with you. Ms. Brianna, should access to contraception and family planning services be guaranteed as a fundamental right?
Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt. I know Amy has touched on it already, and you heard about it in the last panel if you were here. But yes, absolutely. So With the overturning of Roe and the Dobbs decision, it is a real and valid fear to have if, the Supreme Court will overturn on other fundamental rights. And one of those fundamental rights being the right to privacy. There's actually no enumerated right to contraception. It is instead found in key Supreme Court case law, particularly Griswold, that recognize a fundamental right to privacy, and also stemmed from that the fundamental right to access contraception. Of course, in limited cases, but it has been expanded, blah, 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 law school. And so the issue, though, is that at any point in time, the Supreme Court, which we have seen as like a judicial activist court, could overturn Griswold or severely limit, who has access to contraception, the types that are accessible, etc. And so we are in a moment where many states are pushing for amending their state constitutions to recognize a right to reproductive freedom. And so it encompasses not only abortion, but also contraception, other types of family formation, reproductive health care tools, whether it be IVF, sterilization, care, care throughout the entire pregnancy from beginning to end. I mean, it's an all-encompassing right. And one of those states that's pushing for that is Virginia. And so because we live in a very complicated state for no reason, we have a legislative referral process to amend our Constitution. And so this requires us to draft the constitutional amendment, something that we are doing with HRRJL and the Latina Institute, Birth and Color, so many amazing Planned Parenthood, all the repro rights organizations, as well as providers and other stakeholders, to push a constitutional amendment through our legislature. We have to get it through the legislature twice. We have to get it through in 2025. We then have to have an intervening House election, that House of Delegates election I mentioned earlier in 2025. We have to maintain the pro-reproductive freedom rights or friendly House, then pass the amendment again in 2026 before it's able to get on the November 2026 ballot for Virginians to actually vote on. So it's so important that we pass this constitutional amendment and that we ensure it is the most expansive, reimagined version of reproductive health care that we can bring into reality, because I think it's also important to note that Roe was a terrible precedent. Roe was so limiting and was chipped away at over decades by anti-abortion extremists, but never actually made abortion or reproductive health care accessible for marginalized communities, just never did. And so when we think about reproductive freedom, we think about codifying a fundamental right to contraception and family planning services, we have to dream above Roe. We cannot codify Roe. We have to codify a right to reproductive freedom to ensure that we are meeting the needs of everybody.
Thank you. Amy, what legislative measure can be taken to address barriers to accessing reproductive health care services, particularly for marginalized communities?
Again, if Virginia would adopt this constitutional amendment for reproductive freedom, that'd be great. If the governor would pass the Contraceptive Equity Act without making an exemption for religious freedom, that would be wonderful. We have these policies that are ready to go. And we have legislators and other lobbyists scrambling with each other. And like Brianna mentioned, we don't want to codify Roe. We don't want to go back there. We want to dream as big as we can to cover reproductive justice, reproductive freedom for all people. We don't want to have a constitutional amendment for reproductive freedom that has viability language that still, bans abortion at a certain number of weeks. We want everything. We deserve everything. We deserve to have autonomy over our bodies. We deserve to be able to build our families in ways that make us feel safe and dignified. We deserve to have affordable housing. We deserve to have good education, clean land, air, and water, like I said. So the legislative measures that can be taken to address these barriers in reproductive health care is to make it safe for people to want to have families, to want to build families. and the way that the landscape is now, it's scary. I was an older parent. I had my child when I was 35, and we had to make that decision. Are we gonna start this family because we don't have a lot of money? I was the main breadwinner. My husband was up and coming, going to school, doing all this stuff, and without these, stuff like Medicare to help us have health insurance, we wouldn't have been able to have that child. And a lot of people make these decisions. They feel like they don't have the resources to build families because the federal government doesn't make it safe for people to want to have families. What kind of future are we going to have if we don't have grocery stores in our neighborhoods? How are we going to feed our family if we can't live on the minimum wage that's offered? How are we going to have a nice life? So the legislative measures that can be taken to address barriers to accessing reproductive health care is everything. Make it safe for us to reproduce. Make it safe for us to know about our bodies. We want, good sex education in schools. We want access to all the contraception. We just want to feel safe to be fruitful and multiply. So, in whatever way that we see fit. So, the legislators can get on the messaging. They can use the right language. They can change their hearts and their minds to understand that the breadth of reproductive health care should be open to all, to however they need to use it.
Brianna, how can laws protect the rights of transgender and non-binary individuals in relation to reproductive health care?
There are so many ways to do that, but for time, and we touched on a lot of the issues. I think one thing I'll add to this is it's a complicated protection, but I think it's an important one. Are folks here familiar with SHIELD laws or SHIELD bills? Yes. Okay. So for those who aren't, we've seen a lot of abortion and gender-affirming care access states pass things called SHIELD bills. They're omnibus bills that touch on digital privacy. They touch on civil and criminal law, issuing warrants, subpoenas. They touch on extradition, just all these fun little legal things, as well as protecting providers who provide legal care in the state that they are licensed or operating in, right? And so what we're seeing is that because so many states are banning abortion or banning gender-affirming care, that those seeking care are crossing state lines, states like Virginia, coming to Virginia for that care. But there's a real fear they have that once they return back to their state, that they will be criminalized for accessing care that is legal in Virginia. And so, or legal in Massachusetts, California, Washington, New Mexico, every state that right now is an access state has either passed or is contemplating and currently trying to pass these types of SHIELD bills. So both provider and patient feel safer accessing that care because they don't have to face the fear or risk of being criminalized or penalized for accessing legal care. And so it's a very complicated, I promise you I'm not going to get into it, but we hear often from providers, why can't Virginia do this? And we actually did try this past year. We had 4 different SHIELD bills introduced. All 4 were vetoed by our governor. Because again, we know what people in power, anti-abortion extremists, want to ensure that, we don't have access to care. And so that's unfortunate, but I know organizations like the ACLU of Virginia, HRRJL, the Virginia Reproductive Equity Alliance, so many folks will be continuing to push for these SHIELD bills in Virginia. Just again, while they are so legally complicated, while they really do rely on the executive for fair enforcement, it's so annoying, they are still something that our community members want to see, and they're something that our organizations are prioritizing to provide that sense of safety when accessing care.
Thank you. Amy, should there be legal protections against discrimination in healthcare settings based on reproductive choices and decisions?
Yes. There should be legal protections for people against discriminating healthcare based on their reproductive choices and decisions. I should be protected if I choose to have an abortion, if I choose to have gender affirming care, if I choose to have my uterus removed. That choice should be protected under the law, whereas it's a decision made by myself and my family, if I choose to consult, and my doctor, who is the expert on this care. So yes, there should be protections for people that want to make reproductive choices for themselves.
Thank you.
Can I say something?
Yes.
There should be protections for the provider, definitely.
Yes.
There has to be, otherwise, one, you're gonna have doctors not trained how to do these procedures.
Yep.
If we keep on having these laws. So if you are someone who is miscarrying, and the same procedure that we do for the abortion, we do for the miscarriage, just the removal of tissue. You're someone who's miscarrying, and I had this happen to me. I was taking call a couple weeks ago in a hospital, not in this area, and there was a woman who was miscarrying. And they were about to send her home. I got a consult saying, hey, she's down here bleeding, and she's slowed down, so it looks like she'll be able to pass the tissue at home. But we just wanted to call you to get your insight. I said, okay, well, if you think you're about to send her home, why are you calling me? Well, she passed out a couple times, but she's alert now, so she's good. So I think she can go home. Well, she passed out. She probably can't go home. So I just went down to see her, right? Because they're about to send her home. This woman needed to go to the OR and have a D&C so that she could live her life, so she would not die. Because if she did not have that and she went home, there's a good chance she could die from hypovolemia because she has no blood in her system. Because your uterus, if it does not get that tissue out, it will bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed, and you could die. And so if you don't have legal protections for the person providing the care, right? Or you keep on making these laws that make no sense and have like this IVF law, and I'm so glad that people stop providing IVF services, honestly, because somebody has to stand up. Make a crazy law. I can't do it because how do I know I'm going to be able to feed my family? I'm not going to lose my license from just providing actual care. I have myself I have done tubal ligations on women who have never had children because they don't want to have children. I have colleagues that would never do that because they are scared to do it. And it's not only scared to do it because of the legal ramifications, but it's also scared maybe the person changes their mind. So there has to be something where there is this relationship between patient and physician. This is the actual relationship that matters when we're making these medical decisions, right? Because I'm taught, I know how to do it, you know what you want, and so we have that conversation, we make the decision, we move on. But when decisions are being made for you and me, between somebody who has no idea what the medical ramifications truly are, it messes everything up, and then it pits people against one another, right? When the actual villain is the one making the law and the decision making.
Thank you so much.
Sorry for adding.
Oh, no, you're fine. Thank you so much for the highlights and highlighting how much work still needs to be done to ensure the rights of women and their decisions over their anatomy from a legal standpoint. At this time, we will ask all panelists to join us up on the stage as we take a moment to answer some of the questions from our audience. Please raise your hands if you have any questions, and a mic will be brought to you, and direct your question to the panelists in which you would wish to guide your question to. Okay,
Not all at once, though, just so we're clear.
I kind of do have a question specifically for you, since we were talking about the lack of care for Black women in healthcare. For the scenario you just gave, that the lady was going to be discharged, was she Black?
She was Black.
Yeah.
She was Black, and I mean, God bless her heart. I walked in, and she's curled up like this. Her whole body is shaking. And I thought, she said, I don't know why I can't stop shaking. You're shaking because you're going into shock. That's why you're shaking. And somebody was actually going to send you home. And honestly, in some ways, I don't fault that person because that person's scared. That physician is scared because it's like, oh, is this an abortion that I'm doing? It's not an abortion. She miscarried. She miscarried days ago. She's been bleeding. But it's not an abortion. But then the language is confused, right? And then there's true fear.
There's true fear. And so people are having their hands tied behind them. And we're unable to provide care that we know how to provide. You know, and if I have to die on the hill so this woman doesn't go home and die and just do the DNC, this is what she needs. Whether there is a heartbeat there or not, she is bleeding out. It is inevitable what's happening. It has to be ended so she can go home to her family. And so these are real life scenarios that are unfortunately happening every day since the overturn.
So, like, you guys are talking about, like, how if abortions are not, like, legal in a certain country, in a certain, like, state or country, and they go to another country that's legal for abortions, and they have it, and they go back to the country that wasn't, will they get in trouble for it?
That is such a good question.
She go to law school.
Follow your mother.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And so I think it depends on like circumstances, right? Like that's the most legal answer you're always going to get is it depends. But I think in the example you bring and the one I was talking about with shield laws, you know, the intent behind a shield law, an example is in Texas, right? Texas has a strict abortion ban, one that has chilled providers' ability to provide care even within the enumerated exceptions because the providers are like, we actually don't know, like, will we get criminalized? And so we've seen several women who want abortions have to leave the state. And so Texas bans abortions. They also have something called a bounty hunter law. It's called Senate Bill 8, came out years ago, that empowers private citizens, if they know, like, I'm a Texan. Let's say I wanted to get an abortion and I told someone, that person is empowered by the state to out me and try to enforce civil penalties on me for going to Virginia to get that abortion, right? So there's nothing we can do, unfortunately, to stop that bounty hunter provision. But what we can do in Virginia is that Texan me goes to Virginia for the abortion. We do have the ability to implement in law protections so that, you know, I can't, if I get the abortion in Virginia, governor says, you bring her back to Texas so we can charge her for getting an abortion that's illegal, and then we also want to slap her with a civil penalty of bounty hunter law. We have the shield law can arguably empower our governor to say, you know what, we're not sending her back to you because she didn't do anything wrong, because she got a legal abortion, because it's legal in Virginia. So we're not sending her back to you to charge her and criminalize her. That's like one example. We also want to provide those protections for providers, right? Sometimes providers can then try to get sued for like violating medical ethics or like professional misconduct, so then they're stripped of their licenses. And shield laws seek to prevent that, saying so long as the provider is providing the care in the state in which it is legal, they cannot lose their license or be like charged or criminalized for providing that care. I know that was a lot of legalese. I'm so bad at talking like a normal person, but I think those are important examples because they're real and they are happening right now. My final point on that is that what I mean when they're happening right now is that the shield protections also apply to gender affirming care. Again, my home state of Texas is going after transgender youth who are accessing gender affirming care in states like Washington, suing the hospitals for personal medical data to criminalize the parents of those kids for going to Washington for that care. Shield bills would prevent that ability to get that medical data, right? So these are the new ways we're trying to prevent the criminalization of people accessing legal care. It sucks that we have to do that though, right? Yeah. Go.
Okay, I was wondering how old was this person you performed hysterectomy on?
In her 20s.
Wait, so if you think about it, if someone can't, like, if there's a vote on abortions in like which state and which cannot, if like the amount of votes passes, but then the president or government doesn't go with it, is it just done, or like?
Someone else want to answer? Legislative?
I just talk a lot, so that's a really good question. You want to be a lobbyist? You want to come hang? So the question is, if like the General Assembly, so they all say we want this bill to become law. They send it to the governor. Because we have like a checks and balance system, the governor in Virginia has the ability to either veto the bill, so that's to say, nope, I don't agree with that. If it's vetoed, we then have to have a super majority in the General Assembly. That's like 2/3 of each body. There's 40 senators in the Senate, 100 delegates in the delegate. You do the math, I'm not a math person. But it requires a super majority to override that veto. We unfortunately don't have the numbers in the General Assembly to override those vetoes, but that's the way our system works. Another thing that he has done for the reproductive bills in particular, he can also amend them. He can rewrite the bills. Like we pass them, they get to his desk and he's like, no, I'm gonna change this. And he's done that. He's gutted our right to contraception bill and wrote in a bunch of nonsense. And so our members then said no and rejected that amendment. They can do that. And then it goes back to him, and now we're waiting. We don't know what he's gonna do. He has till May 17th. But those are just two examples of kind of like that checks and balance. That's part of like the US like government system, whatever that means nowadays, but that's how we see it here in Virginia. Did I answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so for me, thank you all so much to our wonderful panelists for your insight and to our audience for their engagement. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Let's continue to advocate for women's rights in our communities and beyond. Together we can create a much more equitable world for women. And that is all that I have for you.